first of all, remind people, when you moved to Anderson and how you got involved in politics, and then we're going to talk about how you got involved in history.
Well, I moved to Anderson in 1960 and came in order to practice law and practice law with J. Alex Neely Jr. How I got interested in history to a large degree came from clients that I had, most of whom were older than I. Well, virtually all of whom were much older than I. And the sad thing is that so many of the stories that they had to tell just didn't sink in. But then later, I guess it was about the time that I was out of office.
When were you mayor? Just remind me.
1968 to 1972. In those years, it was a 2-year term.
So you followed some pretty famous people in office, right?
Well, Bill Johnston and I ran against each other actually 3 times. The first time he beat me and I beat him the next 2. And of course, Bill Johnson had been mayor, although interveningly, Pete Glenn was mayor and Cathcart was mayor. But he had been mayor for many, many, many years. And then he and I ran against each other those 3 times. Then, frankly, I had said I'd only serve 2 terms, and that's all I served and got out. But it was a very interesting time. In many respects, it was kind of perilous and it was nasty. But it was something that I did enjoy doing.
Well, you were talking about meeting clients that got you interested into history, but you didn't just get interested in the history. You did a pretty deep dive. I mean, you wrote a very comprehensive series of books about the history of Anderson. How did you get that deeply involved?
Well, it was probably early on in the 60s, and I hadn't been here very long. Number one, I didn't have any way of actually writing anything at that point because I didn't have the help in the office that I could use away from our office in order to do it. But I had talked to my daughter, Lynn, who actually had worked in the office for many, many years, and back in, I guess, the early 70s, I talked to her about the trouble was that we were running out of older clients. They had been dying, and that we really should write something. And we really record something at first. We talked about it, but it just wasn't going to work because of the time elements. And then late in the 70s, I had a secretary who was a very fast stenographer, and Lynn and I talked about it again, and even though we'd lost a lot of those clients. And we decided to do it. And thinking we probably, first of all, would just do recordings, and then if we thought we could go beyond that, we would do that. And so I made the recordings, and then we thought that we'd try and get them transcribed to where we could work with them. And then I kind of put them together, and Lynn pretty much proofed them. One thing, I can't spell. Now that spell checker on the computer helps enormously, but even then, if it makes a mistake or if I make a mistake, I don't catch it. But at that point, we went ahead and decided we'd try and put it in a book. I talked to the Friends of the Library after we had pretty much put together the first volume, and they went along with having it published, and then we did the later volume. In both of those volumes, we did 37 people, but in both of them, we also had a couple of other articles. The first one, we had John Hallman, who was not living at that point, but John had done a program, I think it was at the Country Club, and we had the tape of it. And he was very good, not only humorous, but also as an historian. And so we used that as kind of the opening, and then had 37 people, and then we had something at the end that was a printed document, and we did the same thing on the second volume. And it was absolutely amazing to me how many, well, one of the rules we had was that the person had to be living in Anderson County at the time we did the books. They didn't necessarily have to have been native, but most of them were. Probably 75% were, or at least from this area of South Carolina. And it was absolutely amazing to me, these folks coming from so many different backgrounds had done the things that they had done. And a lot of it was because of World War II. You know, once you've seen Paris, that they used to say about the soldiers. But it really was amazing to us. And we tried to have a little bit of knowledge before we interviewed somebody as to what they were doing then or had done in the past. But as we went, we found with regard to those people, the idea moment, all of a sudden it was like they had that flash above their head that they remembered something. And they were not only telling us stories they remembered, they were remembering things that they had forgotten as we went. And it really became kind of a thrill to them, as well as a thrill to us, because here we had them going back on things that they hadn't even remembered that were really, I think, very important. And so it was a lot of fun doing that. I had, I guess one thing that had came before that was that for some years before I got into office, I had written for the Anderson Free Press. And I had done articles there, but of course, much of that was political type stuff and all, but some of it went beyond that, including one article that I didn't even remember I'd written, that when I was doing research I've been doing now, I came across, and it just blew my mind that I had written that thing and I hadn't even remembered it. But
what was that about?
It was what had been apparently written out, most of it, by a prisoner who had escaped from the, not the chain gang, but up here at Camp 2, that then was recaptured, and he wrote this out, and apparently had I think other prisoners must have written it out with him. I did not interview him, and I don't even remember how I got this thing that had been written out. But it was about being up there in the stockade and what their complaints were. Well, it's very hard to find anyone now who had been in the stockade. And here I had an article I had actually written, although I didn't remember it, that was exactly about at least the, you know, you have to take it a little bit with a grain of salt. But some of it I'm sure is true, and maybe all of it. But all of a sudden I find this article that actually I had put together.
That was before Attica.
I'm sorry?
That was just before Attica, too.
Oh, yes. But
any of the stories that you found that you still remember that either surprised you or just stayed with you when you were doing this history research?
Not really, because I didn't have enough background or years in Anderson, so that most of this was historic before then. But as I got into it, it expanded into current years. But you know, that's where we get into what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, and what, anything in there that surprised you about the history of Anderson that you wouldn't have known if you hadn't done this?
I think that what I'm working on surprised me, and I think it surprises other people.
This is your current project.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
Okay. I started off because I've been doing some articles for the Electric City News, and I started off being interested in the old county home, which of course was called almshouse or poorhouse or whatever. But
Remind people where that is, where that property is.
if you, well, part of it I don't know the answer to. If you go out to the Civic Center and drive up Campson Road that goes past the entrance to the Civic Center, it's right on your left. It is a long building that is now a county building. Now I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that was built in 1929, that building was. But when I got into that and found out that, well, in 1841, 2 deeds were made to the commissioners of the poor here in Anderson. And those deeds were for 347 acres of land. And on that land, there were some poorhouses built. Now, this goes back to, which I won't go into, but it goes back to historically how the poor were handled and how they had either workhouses or poorhouses and also farms, county farms. Well, the idea here was that the poorhouse would be on that property and there would be a county farm around it. But this was 347 acres, which I think they paid something like $2,600 for, but that today would be a pretty high figure. They had gotten that money from up in the Pendleton district that Anderson County was in originally with Pickens County, well, and partially at one point with Greenville County. The Pendleton district had a poorhouse, and if you go up Highway 76, where the railroad crosses the road, it was just beyond where that bridge is on the right-hand side. And when that was the poorhouse for the Pendleton County, or Pendleton district. Unfortunately, although I know where it is, I can't find any information on that. I may be able to find it from the archives records. Anyhow, when the counties of Anderson and Pickens were separated, the poorhouse was to be sold, the land it was on, and the money was to be separated between Pickens and Anderson and used for the poorhouse purposes. And so this was obviously part of the money that came to the county of Anderson in order to build the poorhouses here. Apparently the original poorhouses that were here until 1929, I think must have been about 50 yards from where the present location is, but I haven't been able to find anybody who can confirm this. There were both black poorhouses and white, and I'm saying houses because there were a couple of brick ones and a couple of white ones, frame houses for the whites, and they were mainly frame houses for the blacks. But they had to have been right close together because at one point they had a common kitchen. And I think that the new one was built right across. I'm hoping I'll still find out exactly where that happened. When you look at the old county home road, it shows in an 1887 map what looks like it's almost exactly where the present one is. And the present one, incidentally, I referred to as present one, in 1969 closed and is now county offices. and it's still being used. It's a very long building, and I haven't been inside, but it's attractive on the outside.
It was still a poorhouse and
No, in 1969, that's when the last person left. And incidentally, there are good records of from 1942 on for any genealogists that about listing all of the people, how they came in, how they went out, whether they went out voluntarily or died, and if they died, generally where they were buried, and some of which is on the property. Because right across from the recycling center is a white picket fence area, and that was the old county home burial spot, and also some of the black prisoners were buried there. But anyway, this is where that property started. But the amazing thing is what's on it now and how it's developed. Now, it started with the county home. The next thing that was there, other than the county farm, was the first county airport, or airfield. It wasn't a port. And that airfield apparently stretched towards the county home. And all it was a bumpy field that some of these little small planes took off from. You may have known Harry Osteen. Harry flew a plane off of there that belonged to somebody else, but he was somebody else's father, but he was told if he brought the gas out, he could fly it. And it was a very bumpy field, but that is also where Amelia Earhart came in. And that site, generally at least, is identified right now up at the Civic Center. Unfortunately, well, there's if you are facing the Civic Center from the Martin Luther King Boulevard, it's at the end of the parking lot on the right-hand side, and there's an iron fence there, and a flagpole without a flag because the flag was stolen, and without a marker because the marker apparently was stolen. But anyway, of course, a lot of people went out to meet her. The thing that she came in for was beech nut gum. She was on a promotional trip, and she was handing out beachies to the kids. And so a number of people drove out. They had to go up McGee Road, and then they apparently went up they went up a hill, and they apparently went up past the county home to the field where that was. But in this property...
Wait, before you leave that,
sure.
People there's pictures at the Anderson County Museum if they want to see that visit. There's
yes.
some photos up there.
Right. And there's information here too in the library. This property starts, and it's part of property that was conveyed by Alan Gentry. And it starts basically where the balloon field is, and includes where the balloons are launched. It goes over past where the lights are for the Christmas Hope of Lights, and the Santa's Village, and then to the recycling center. And incidentally, the recycling center is where the black prison camp was. And if you go to the recycling center and come out the gate that's closest to where the Civic Center is, and you look to your right, you will see what was called the Hole. That is a cinder block building that's inside is about 5 feet by 5 feet by 5 feet high. And the only light that comes in was through if there was a break in the wooden door and a pipe that came out the top for air. And the hole was where the prisoners who wouldn't obey were put in chains, even though they were in the cinder block building. But anyway, that's this area on the south side of Martin Luther King Boulevard was part of it. Then Martin Luther King Boulevard comes through it. Then as you go up the hill, the Civic Center is in the property. If you go over on the left-hand side, first of all, you've got the Vocational Rehab Center, and that's in it. If you go on out to McGee Road, that's in it, and you go up past all those county health buildings, they all are in that property. If you come back over to where the Civic Center is, and incidentally, you will have passed the old county home doing that, all of the ball fields for the recreation area are in it, except the last ball field before you get to the Civic Center Boulevard. Across from the ball fields, across the Jim Ed Rice Road, is the disc golf course that's in it. You come down that road back to the left again, and you pass all the soccer fields. They were all in it. And if you go back up, well, of course, back to McGee Road, you have not only those health buildings, but you have the Veterans Memorial there. You have passed the detention center. And then when you come back again, you come back to where the sheriff's office is and where the Chris Taylor Park is. The sheriff's office, of course, is in a transition because it's moving. Now, pardon my 2 cents, but I hope that that building can be used for a county purpose, because that whole area is that 347 acres, and I think it would be a shame if that doesn't stay there. Now, how is another question. Of course, what I would personally love to see would be the museum go out there, but the museum has just finished construction work. But it could be sort of like a museum, maybe a learning center of some sort. The genealogy people definitely need new facilities. They could be out there. The building could be used for antique, like antique farm equipment. It could have, now walls would have to be taken out. There's no question about that. But it could have all kinds of displays, perhaps some natural history displays. If it could be big enough, it could take exhibits that could come from places like the Field Museum in Chicago, Benjamin Franklin Institute in Philadelphia, or the Smithsonian. Places of that sort have field exhibits that they send out. So I think it would make one whale of a nifty facility. Now, it would take a lot more imaginations than mine to decide what could go in there. But I mean, you could even have the astronomy clubs from Anderson and Clemson. There are just any number of things that could go in there.
Have you talked to anybody who lived out there or remembers it well? Or
I have interviewed several people who have remembered these things, but most of them were about 10 or 11 or 12 years old. For instance, what they may have gone with grandfather to pick up prisoners who went out and worked on the farm. And incidentally, they weren't paid for it. It was a courtesy. And in fact, the prisoners preferred it because they got a good meal that way, and usually they'd get a little money that they didn't need to be paid, but they were given some money for the work that they did. And so there have been some folks there. I have found nobody who could talk about the home as such. Unfortunately, even in the last several months, I have lost, for one person died who was a guard out there. And I know there can be a few people left. I've talked to a few people who have been at the camps that went out there for one reason or another, possibly to meet John Tom Ashley, who was a supervisor then, or in one case, it was Ray Taylor, who was a city police officer who took some prisoners out there occasionally, and he ate at the dining hall there. So there have been a couple of people I've been able to talk to about that, but I very greatly need to find anyone else who can possibly tell me anything really about any of the history out there, particularly leading up to the 30s, 40s, well, and even up into the 50s or 60s. It's just, there's very little that has been written about any of this. Now, one thing that has helped an awful lot is in 1915, a board of charities and convictions, that's not right, but it's something like that, had gone throughout the state and studied each county as far as how they were handling poorhouses and how they were handling the prisoners, most of which then were chain gang. And they have very complete reports, how much they were fed in each community. I mean, we know now what Anderson prisoners and county home people ate for their breakfast and their lunch, or what they call dinner. County home didn't have any supper. They could make their own coffee. The prisoners were given some supper because they were working so hard. Pretty amazing what they did accomplish. If the supervisors and the prisoners had not done the road work they did, Anderson County would have been way behind in its development. The bridges and the roads, and plus the maintenance of the roads, not just the building. Some of them that I knew, and let me mention K.H. Campbell. K.H. Campbell couldn't read or write, but had basically a photographic memory. He was a farmer, and he could remember from years past how much he was paid for items that he had produced, and how much per pound and so on. It was an amazing memory. And so many of the folks back then had to go by that memory. They did not have the education to have written it down, and probably it's a good thing they didn't, because they did have such a fantastic memory there.
Well, you obviously have this spark of curiosity for history. What in particular made you interested in this project?
Well, it's just because I started looking at something about the county home, and all of a sudden it broadened into the prisoner situation, and then the airfield, and then frankly, I felt as hard as it was to get the past information, if I could go ahead and get the present information from the county on what was being done and what had been done, that it would then be available for somebody in the future who would be going back and researching, because they'd have so much trouble getting it otherwise. And frankly, it's blown my mind. It's blown my mind how the sports part works. To see how that has developed, I would have just imagined that they would have a few sports teams, maybe they were handling or whatever, but instead, this is a program like owning a football stadium. You own the facility, and they come to you. Well, you go to them too, but they come to you, and bring these fantastic programs and bring a whole lot of tourists in for those programs. Well, last night I went out to the area where they have disc golf and followed around a group, and they were very helpful telling me how it worked. But it's a great thing. It's going through the woods there at different targets you can't even see when they leave the tee, and they have all this different equipment that they work with. Well, I had never seen anything like that. I'd never seen pickleball before I went out there. They are, well, and when you look at the four of the baseball fields and go upstairs on their third floor where they have the press boxes, and see what they can do there and make the announcements down on each of those fields. It's amazing to me. And the Civic Center is amazing how they can handle bringing in the different walls in order to have the programs they have and the programs that they have. Like coming up this weekend is an archery tournament with youngsters. And then later this month it'll be a wrestling program, and bringing in the schools and the groups, as well as, of course, having it there for speakers and all. But these are professional programs that are being handled by these different groups.
When do you hope to have your project completed?
I think it'll probably be the end of the year because I want to get back and see some of the things and photograph myself some of the things like the balloons. I saw some of the balloons earlier this year, but I really hadn't considered even expanding the program. I do want to talk some more, other than what I've gotten from your programs, to the sheriff, because some of the things there too have absolutely amazed me. When I look at that wraparound program he has for training. Now, I've been through training with just a single screen, but to look at that wraparound thing is absolutely amazing. And if there was any way to somehow duplicate that in the building that I would like to see being a county building, and there very likely is something similar for fire. And it would be such an educational and interesting thing for people to see if they could see and experience those things. Of course, I'm so darned excited about this 347 acres now, and what has been done by the people here. It just blows my mind.
What's your next project? I mean, you've done other projects in the past, like the names of streets and other things. What's your next project?
Well, I have been writing these articles that are short articles about some of the different historic aspects, and I do expect to go on with that. Of course, the one thing that I do have to face up with is my memory is much, much shorter. And it's a little harder to do some of those things. But I think it all just depends on what pops up. I really do want to try and do something on Mayor Pete Glenn, because I think he is probably one of the best mayors Anderson's ever had. And he had a tough time. And I'd like to be able to somewhat spell out what he was able to accomplish.